After witnessing God's power split the Red Sea and hearing his thunderous voice declare the 10 Commandments from Mount Sinai, Israel stood at a crossroads. Would they truly become God's holy nation? The laws that followed weren't just rules. They were a blueprint for justice, compassion, and worship, unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. God was about to give them something extraordinary. Detailed plans for a dwelling place where the creator of the universe would live among his people. But first, a devastating betrayal would threaten everything. Golden metal, forbidden worship, and one man's intercession would determine whether an entire nation survived. This is the story of how God's presence came to earth. The story begins in Egypt, where something terrible was about to happen. The descendants of Jacob had come to this land during Joseph's time, and they had multiplied greatly. Chapter 1, verse 7 tells us the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. But then everything changed. A new king came to power in Egypt, and this Pharaoh knew nothing about Joseph or how he had saved Egypt from famine. When this new ruler looked at the Hebrew people, he didn't see friends. He saw a threat. In verse 9, he told his people, "Look, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So Pharaoh made a cruel decision. He forced the Israelites into hard labor, making them build the storage cities of Pithom and Ramesses. The Egyptians worked them ruthlessly, making their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. Verse 14 says, "They used them ruthlessly in all their hard labor." But here's what Pharaoh didn't expect. The more the Egyptians oppressed the Israelites, the more they multiplied and spread. This made the Egyptians dread them even more. So Pharaoh came up with an even darker plan. He called for 2 Hebrew midwives named Shiphrah and Puah and gave them a horrifying command. In verse 16 he said, "When you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live." But these midwives feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. They let the baby boys live. When Pharaoh called them back and asked why they had done this, they answered wisely in verse 19, "Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive." God was kind to these midwives, and the people continued to multiply and become even more numerous. Pharaoh grew desperate. He gave an order to all his people in verse 22. "Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live." This was genocide, a plan to destroy God's people completely. During this dark time, a man from the family of Levi married a Levite woman. Chapter 2, verse 2 tells us she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she couldn't hide him any longer, she got a papyrus basket, coated it with tar and pitch, placed the child in it, and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. The baby's sister stood at a distance to see what would happen. Then Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the Nile. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. When she opened it, she saw the baby crying, and her heart filled with compassion. Verse 6 says she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. The baby's sister quickly approached and asked if she should find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. Pharaoh's daughter agreed, and the girl brought the baby's own mother. Pharaoh's daughter told her in verse 9, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. She named him Moses, saying in verse 10, "I drew him out of the water." Moses grew up and one day went out to where his own people were working. He watched them at their hard labor and saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. Looking around and seeing no one, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he saw two Hebrews fighting and tried to separate them. But one of them said in verse 14, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses realized what he had done was known, and when Pharaoh heard about it, he tried to kill Moses. Moses fled to Midian, where he sat down by a well. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters who came to draw water, but some shepherds came and drove them away. Moses got up and helped them water their flock. When they returned home early, their father Reuel asked why, and they explained in verse 19, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." Moses ended up staying with this family and married one of the daughters, Zipporah. She gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, "I have become a foreigner in a foreign land." Years passed. The king of Egypt died, but the Israelites still groaned under their slavery and cried out for help. Verse 24 tells us, God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro near Horeb, the mountain of God. There in chapter 3, verse 2, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. When Moses went closer to look, God called to him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses!" Moses answered, "Here I am." God told him in verse 5, "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Then God said something powerful in verse 7, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." God was sending Moses back to Egypt to bring his people out. Moses protested, asking who he was to do this great task. But God promised in verse 12, "I will be with you." Moses asked what he should say when people asked God's name. God answered in verse 14 with the most important name, "I am who I am." This is what you are to say to the Israelites, "I am has sent me to you." God gave Moses signs to perform. His staff would become a snake, his hand would become leprous and then heal, and he could turn water from the Nile into blood. Still, Moses protested that he wasn't a good speaker. In chapter 4, verse 14, the Lord's anger burned against Moses. But he said, "What about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well." God would tell Moses what to say, and Aaron would speak to the people. Moses went back to Jethro and asked to return to Egypt. Jethro told him to go in peace. The Lord said to Moses in verse 19, "Go back to Egypt, for all those who wanted to kill you are dead." Moses and Aaron gathered all the elders of the Israelites. Aaron told them everything the Lord had said to Moses and performed the signs before the people. Chapter 4, verse 31 says, "They believed, and when they heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshipped. Then Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh. They told him in chapter 5, verse 1, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh's response was cold and proud. In verse 2 he said, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." They explained that the God of the Hebrews had met with them and asked to take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices. But Pharaoh wasn't moved. Instead, he made things worse. That same day, he gave orders to the slave drivers and overseers in verse 7, "You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota." The slave drivers kept pressing them, demanding they complete their daily quota even without straw. When they couldn't, the Israelite overseers were beaten. These overseers went to Pharaoh to complain, but he called them lazy. In verse 17 he said, "Lazy, that's what you are, lazy. That is why you keep saying, 'Let us go and sacrifice to the Lord.'" He sent them back to work with no straw, but the same quota. The Israelite overseers realized they were in serious trouble. When they met Moses and Aaron, they said in verse 21, "May the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." Moses returned to the Lord and cried out in verse 22, "Why, Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all." But the Lord answered Moses in chapter 6, verse 1, "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand he will drive them out of his country." God reminded Moses of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he promised in verse 6, "I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment." Moses reported this to the Israelites, but verse 9 tells us they did not listen to him because of their discouragement and harsh labor. The Lord told Moses to go tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites leave, but Moses protested in verse 12. "If the Israelites will not listen to me, why would Pharaoh listen to me, since I speak with faltering lips?" Yet the Lord commanded both Moses and Aaron to speak to both the Israelites and Pharaoh. The Lord spoke to Moses in chapter 7, verse 1, saying, "See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron will be your prophet. You are to say everything I command you, and your brother Aaron is to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of his country." God also warned that he would harden Pharaoh's heart so that he could multiply his signs and wonders in Egypt. Then the Egyptians would know that he is the Lord. Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. The Lord told Moses that when Pharaoh asked for a sign, Aaron should throw down his staff, and it would become a snake. They did just as the Lord commanded. In verse 10, Aaron threw his staff down in front of Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a snake. But Pharaoh summoned his wise men and sorcerers, and the Egyptian magicians did the same things by their secret arts. Each one threw down his staff, and it became a snake. However, verse 12 says, Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Even so, Pharaoh's heart became hard, and he wouldn't listen. The Lord told Moses that Pharaoh's heart was unyielding, and he refused to let the people go. In the morning, Moses was to confront Pharaoh as he went to the Nile River. God said in verse 17, "This is what the Lord says, by this you will know that I am the Lord. With the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood." Moses and Aaron did exactly as the Lord commanded. In verse 20, he raised his staff in the presence of Pharaoh and his officials and struck the water of the Nile, and all the water was changed into blood. The fish in the Nile died, and the river smelled so bad that the Egyptians could not drink its water. Blood was everywhere in Egypt. But the Egyptian magicians did the same things by their secret arts, so Pharaoh's heart remained hard. He turned and went into his palace without taking this to heart. All the Egyptians dug along the Nile to get drinking water because they couldn't drink the river water. 7 full days passed after the Lord struck the Nile. The Lord told Moses to go to Pharaoh again and say in chapter 8, verse 1, "This is what the Lord says, let my people go so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will send a plague of frogs on your whole country." The frogs would come up into his palace, his bedroom, his bed, the houses of his officials and people, and even into their ovens and kneading bowls. Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land. But the magicians did the same thing with their secret arts, bringing up more frogs. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said in verse 8, "Pray to the Lord to take the frogs away from me and my people, and I will let your people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord." Moses replied that Pharaoh could set the time, and Pharaoh said, "Tomorrow." Moses prayed, and verse 13 tells us, "The Lord did what Moses asked. The frogs died in the houses, in the courtyards, and in the fields. They were piled into heaps, and the land reeked of them. But when Pharaoh saw there was relief, he hardened his heart. Then the Lord told Moses to have Aaron strike the dust of the ground." Verse 17 says, "Aaron stretched out his hand with the staff and struck the dust of the ground, and gnats came on people and animals. All the dust throughout the land of Egypt became gnats." The magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, but they couldn't. The gnats were on people and animals everywhere. The magicians said to Pharaoh in verse 19, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hard. The Lord told Moses to confront Pharaoh in the morning again and say in verse 20, "This is what the Lord says, 'Let my people go, so that they may worship me. If you do not let my people go, I will send swarms of flies on you and your officials, on your people and into your houses." But God made a distinction. Verse 22 says, "But on that day I will deal differently with the land of Goshen, where my people live. No swarms of flies will be there, so that you will know that I, the Lord, am in this land." Dense swarms of flies poured into Pharaoh's palace and the houses of his officials. Throughout Egypt, the land was ruined by the flies. Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said in verse 25, "Go, sacrifice to your God here in the land." But Moses refused, explaining they needed to go 3 days into the wilderness. Pharaoh agreed, but told them not to go very far. Moses prayed, and the Lord removed the flies. But verse 32 says, "But this time also Pharaoh hardened his heart and would not let the people go." The Lord sent Moses to Pharaoh again with a message in chapter 9, verse 1. "This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says, 'Let my people go, so that they may worship me.' If you refuse to let them go and continue to hold them back, the hand of the Lord will bring a terrible plague on your livestock in the field." The next day, the Lord did this. Verse 6 says, "All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not one animal belonging to the Israelites died." Pharaoh investigated and found that not even one of the animals of the Israelites had died. Yet his heart remained unyielding. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in verse 8, "Take handfuls of soot from a furnace and have Moses toss it into the air in the presence of Pharaoh. It will become fine dust over the whole land of Egypt, and festering boils will break out on people and animals throughout the land." They took soot from a furnace and stood before Pharaoh. Moses tossed it into the air, and verse 10 tells us, "Festering boils broke out on people and animals." The magicians couldn't stand before Moses because of the boils that were on them and all the Egyptians. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. Then the Lord told Moses to confront Pharaoh early in the morning and deliver a stern message in verse 13. "This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says, 'Let my people go, so that they may worship me, or this time I will send the full force of my plagues against you and against your officials and your people, so you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth.'" God could have wiped them out completely, but he had raised Pharaoh up for this very purpose, to show his power and to make his name known in all the earth. God announced that the next day he would send the worst hailstorm Egypt had ever seen. Verse 19 says, "Give an order now to bring your livestock and everything you have in the field to a place of shelter, because the hail will fall on every person and animal that has not been brought in and is still out in the field, and they will die." Those officials of Pharaoh who feared the Lord's word hurried to bring their slaves and livestock inside. But those who ignored his word left them in the field. Moses stretched out his staff toward the sky, and in verse 23, the Lord sent thunder and hail, and lightning flashed down to the ground. So the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. Hail fell, and lightning flashed back and forth. It was the worst storm in all of Egypt since it had become a nation. Throughout Egypt, the hail struck everything in the fields, both people and animals. It beat down everything growing and stripped every tree. The only place it didn't hail was in Goshen, where the Israelites lived. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said in verse 27, "This time I have sinned. The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to the Lord, for we have had enough thunder and hail. I will let you go. You don't have to stay any longer." Moses agreed to pray, saying in verse 29, "When I have gone out of the city, I will spread out my hands in prayer to the Lord. The thunder will stop, and there will be no more hail, so you may know that the earth is the Lord's." Moses left the city, spread out his hands to the Lord, and the thunder and hail stopped. But when Pharaoh saw this, verse 34 says he sinned again. He and his officials hardened their hearts. The Lord said to Moses in chapter 10, in verse 1, "Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his officials, so that I may perform these signs of mine among them, that you may tell your children and grandchildren how I dealt harshly with the Egyptians, and how I performed my signs among them, and that you may know that I am the Lord." Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. How long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go, so that they may worship me. If you refuse, tomorrow I will bring locusts into your country." Pharaoh's officials said to him in verse 7, "How long will this man be a snare to us? Let the people go, so that they may worship the Lord their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" Moses and Aaron were brought back to Pharaoh, who asked who exactly would be going. Moses answered in verse 9, "We will go with our young and our old, with our sons and our daughters, and with our flocks and herds, because we are to celebrate a festival to the Lord." Pharaoh refused and drove them out of his presence. The Lord told Moses to stretch out his hand over Egypt so that locusts would swarm over the land. Moses stretched out his staff, and the Lord made an east wind blow all day and night. By morning, the wind had brought the locusts. Verse 14 says, "They invaded all Egypt and settled down in every area of the country in great numbers. Never before had there been such a plague of locusts, nor will there ever be again. They covered the ground until it was black, devouring everything left after the hail." Pharaoh quickly summoned Moses and Aaron and said in verse 16, "I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Now forgive my sin once more and pray to the Lord your God to take this deadly plague away from me." Moses left and prayed, and the Lord changed the wind to a very strong west wind that caught up the locusts and carried them into the Red Sea. Not a single locust was left in Egypt, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart again. Then the Lord said to Moses in verse 21, "Stretch out your hand toward the sky so that darkness spreads over Egypt, darkness that can be felt." Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and verse 22 tells us, "Total darkness covered all Egypt for 3 days. No one could see anyone else or move about for 3 days. Yet all the Israelites had light in the places where they lived." Pharaoh summoned Moses and said he would let them go worship, but they must leave their flocks and herds behind. Moses refused, saying in verse 26, "Our livestock too must go with us. Not a hoof is to be left behind." Pharaoh's heart remained hard. In verse 28, Pharaoh shouted at Moses, "Get out of my sight. Make sure you do not appear before me again. The day you see my face, you will die." Moses replied, "Just as you say, I will never appear before you again." The Lord spoke to Moses after Pharaoh had driven him away, telling him something that would change everything. Chapter 11, verse 1 says, "Now the Lord had said to Moses, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, He will let you go from here, and when he does, he will drive you out completely. God instructed Moses to tell the people to ask their Egyptian neighbors for articles of silver and gold. The Lord made the Egyptians look favorably on the people, and Moses himself was highly regarded in Egypt by Pharaoh's officials and the people. Moses delivered God's final warning. He told Pharaoh in verse 4, "This is what the Lord says. About midnight I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sits on the throne, to the firstborn son of the female slave who is at her handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well." Moses continued in verse 6, "There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again. But among the Israelites not a dog will bark at any person or animal. Then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel." Moses told Pharaoh that all his officials would come bowing down to him, begging Israel to leave. Then Moses, hot with anger, left Pharaoh's presence. The Lord had told Moses that Pharaoh would refuse to listen, so that his wonders would be multiplied in Egypt. Verse 10 says, "Moses and Aaron performed all these wonders before Pharaoh, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go out of his country." The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, establishing something completely new for his people. Chapter 12, verse 2 says, "This month is to be for you the first month of your year." God was giving them a new beginning, a new calendar that would forever mark their deliverance. On the 10th day of this month, each family was to take a lamb for their household. Verse 5 tells us, "The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats." They would keep the animal until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community would slaughter them at twilight. Then came the crucial instruction. Verse 7 says, "Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. That night they would eat the meat roasted over fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast." Verse 8 specifies, "That same night they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast." Nothing could be left until morning. Any remainder must be burned. They were to eat in haste, dressed to travel with their cloak tucked into their belt, sandals on their feet, and staff in hand. Verse 11 calls it the Lord's Passover. God explained why in verse 12, "On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt." This day would become a lasting ordinance for Israel, a festival to the Lord for generations to come. For 7 days they were to eat bread made without yeast. Verse 15 says, "For 7 days you are to eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, remove the yeast from your houses, for whoever eats anything with yeast in it from the first day through the 7th must be cut off from Israel." The 1st and 7th days would be sacred assemblies with no work except preparing food. They were to celebrate the festival of unleavened bread, because on this very day God brought them out of Egypt. Verse 17 makes it clear, "Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for the generations to come." From the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day, they were to eat bread without yeast. No yeast was to be found in their houses, and anyone who ate anything with yeast would be cut off from the community. Verse 20 says, "Eat nothing made with yeast. Wherever you live, you must eat unleavened bread." Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and gave them these instructions, adding in verse 23, "When the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the top and sides of the doorframe, and will pass over that doorway, and he will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses and strike you down. This was to be a lasting ordinance for them and their descendants. When they entered the land God would give them, they would observe this ceremony. Verse 26 says, "And when your children ask you, 'What does this ceremony mean to you?' then tell them, 'It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians.'" The people bowed down and worshipped, and the Israelites went away and did exactly what the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. At midnight, the Lord struck down every firstborn in Egypt. Chapter 12, verse 29 tells us the devastating scope. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials got up during the night, and all the Egyptians rose too. Verse 30 says, "There was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead." During that very night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. His voice was different now, no longer filled with pride and defiance. Verse 31 records his words, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said and go, and also bless me." The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, saying in verse 33, "For otherwise we will all die." The very people who had enslaved Israel for years now begged them to leave. The Israelites did as Moses instructed. They asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, and verse 36 tells us, "The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for, so they plundered the Egyptians." The people took their dough before the yeast was added, carrying it on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in clothing. The Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkoth. Verse 37 gives us the numbers. There were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Many other people went up with them, and they also took large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. With the dough they had brought from Egypt, they baked loaves of unleavened bread, because it had no yeast. Verse 39 explains, "The dough was without yeast, because they had been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves." The Israelites had lived in Egypt 430 years. Verse 41 says, "At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt. Because the Lord kept vigil that night to bring them out of Egypt, on this night all the Israelites were to keep vigil to honor the Lord for the generations to come." The Lord gave Moses and Aaron specific regulations about the Passover. Chapter 12, verse 43 says, "These are the regulations for the Passover meal. No foreigner may eat it. Any slave who had been bought and circumcised could eat it, but a temporary resident or hired worker could not." Verse 46 specifies, "It must be eaten inside the house. Take none of the meat outside the house. Do not break any of the bones." The whole community of Israel must celebrate it. A foreigner residing among them who wanted to celebrate the Lord's Passover must have all the males in his household circumcised. Then he could take part like one born in the land. Verse 48 says, "No uncircumcised male may eat it." The same law applied to both the native-born and the foreigner residing among them. All the Israelites did exactly what the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. On that very day, the Lord brought the Israelites out of Egypt by their divisions. The Lord spoke to Moses, establishing another lasting ordinance. Chapter 13, verse 2 says, "Consecrate to me every firstborn male. The first offspring of every womb among the Israelites belongs to me, whether human or animal." Moses told the people to commemorate this day, the day they came out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, because the Lord brought them out with a mighty hand. Nothing containing yeast was to be eaten. They were leaving in the month of Aviv. When the Lord brought them into the land he had promised their ancestors, a land flowing with milk and honey. They were to observe this ceremony in that month. Verse 6 says, "For 7 days eat bread made without yeast, and on the 7th day hold a festival to the Lord." For 7 days bread without yeast must be eaten, and nothing with yeast was to be seen in their territory. Moses instructed them in verse 8, "On that day tell your son, I do this because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt." This observance would be like a sign on their hand and a reminder on their forehead that the Lord's law was to be on their lips, because he brought them out of Egypt with his mighty hand. The Lord gave another command about the firstborn. Verse 12 says, "You are to give over to the Lord the first offspring of every womb. All the firstborn males of your livestock belong to the Lord. Every firstborn donkey must be redeemed with a lamb, but if they didn't redeem it, they must break its neck. Every firstborn among their sons must be redeemed." Verse 14 explains, "In days to come, when your son asks you, 'What does this mean?' say to him, 'With a mighty hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed the firstborn of both people and animals in Egypt. This is why I sacrifice to the Lord the first male offspring of every womb and redeem each of my firstborn sons." This would be like a sign on their hand and a symbol on their forehead that the Lord brought them out of Egypt with his mighty hand. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. Chapter 13, verse 17 explains why. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath, saying in verse 19, "God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place." They left Succoth and camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. Verse 21 says, "By day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. The Lord told Moses to have the Israelites turn back and camp near Pi-hahiroth between Migdol and the sea. Chapter 14, verse 3 explains God's strategy. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. The Israelites did this. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds. Verse 5 says, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." Pharaoh had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. Verse 8 tells us, "The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites, who were marching out boldly." The Egyptians pursued the Israelites with all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, and overtook them as they camped by the sea. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up and saw the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses in verse 11, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Moses answered the people with words of faith. Verse 13 records his response. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." The Lord said to Moses in verse 15, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. God would harden the hearts of the Egyptians so they would go in after them, and he would gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army. Then something remarkable happened. Verse 19 says, "Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other side. So neither group went near the other all night long." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and verse 21 tells us, "All that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army." Chapter 14, verse 24, says he threw the Egyptian army into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. The Egyptians said in verse 25, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord spoke to Moses. Verse 26 records, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. Verse 28 says, "The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived, but the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore." Verse 31 tells us, "And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. Then Moses and the Israelites sang a song to the Lord." Chapter 15, verse 1 begins, "I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea." They sang that the Lord was their strength and their defense. He had become their salvation. He was their God, and they would praise him. Verse 3 declares, "The Lord is a warrior, the Lord is his name." They sang about how Pharaoh's chariots and army were cast into the sea, and the best of his officers were drowned in the Red Sea. The deep waters covered them, and they sank to the depths like a stone. The song continued praising God's power. Verse 6 says, "Your right hand, Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, Lord, shattered the enemy. In his great majesty, he threw down those who opposed him. He unleashed his burning anger, which consumed them like stubble." Verse 8 describes how, "By the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The surging waters stood up like a wall. The deep waters congealed in the heart of the sea." The enemy had boasted that they would pursue, overtake, divide the spoils, and draw their swords. But God blew with his breath, and the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. They sang in verse 11, "Who among the gods is like you, Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders?" God stretched out his right hand, and the earth swallowed the enemies. In his unfailing love, he guided the people he had redeemed and led them to his holy dwelling. The nations heard and trembled. Anguish gripped the people of Philistia. The chiefs of Edom were terrified. The leaders of Moab were seized with trembling, and the people of Canaan melted away. The song concluded with confidence. Verse 16 says, "Terror and dread will fall on them. By the power of your arm, they will be as still as a stone, until your people pass by, Lord, until the people you bought pass by." God would bring them in and plant them on the mountain of his inheritance, the place he made for his dwelling, the sanctuary his hands established. Verse 18 declares triumphantly, "The Lord reigns forever and ever." When Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen went into the sea, the Lord brought the waters of the sea back over them, but the Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground. Then Miriam the prophet, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women followed her with timbrels and dancing. Verse 21 records Miriam singing to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea." Moses led Israel from the Red Sea into the desert of Shur. They traveled for 3 days without finding water. Chapter 15, verse 22 says, "For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, they couldn't drink the water because it was bitter. That's why the place was called Marah." The people grumbled against Moses, asking in verse 24, "What are we to drink?" Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. When Moses threw it into the water became fit to drink. There at Marah, the Lord issued a ruling and instruction for them and put them to the test. Verse 26 records God's words, "If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. Chapter 16, verse 1, tells us this happened on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they had come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. Verse 3 reveals their complaint. "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." The memory of slavery had already faded, replaced by fear and hunger. The Lord said to Moses in verse 4, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way, I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions." On the 6th day, they were to prepare what they brought in, and it would be twice as much as they gathered on the other days. Moses and Aaron told all the Israelites that in the evening they would know it was the Lord who brought them out of Egypt, and in the morning they would see the glory of the Lord. Verse 7 says, "In the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us?" They explained that the Lord would give them meat to eat in the evening and bread in the morning, because he had heard their grumbling. Moses told Aaron to say to the entire community in verse 9, "Come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling." While Aaron was speaking, they looked toward the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. The Lord said to Moses in verse 12, "I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." That evening quail came and covered the camp. In the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost appeared on the desert floor. Chapter 16, verse 15 says, "When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, 'What is it?' For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, 'It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat.'" God gave specific instructions about gathering this bread. Verse 16 records, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Everyone is to gather as much as they need. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent." The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some little. When they measured it by the omer, the one who gathered much didn't have too much, and the one who gathered little didn't have too little. Everyone had gathered just what they needed. Moses told them in verse 19, "No one is to keep any of it until morning." However, some of them paid no attention and kept part of it until morning. Verse 20 tells us what happened. But it was full of maggots and began to smell. So Moses was angry with them. Each morning everyone gathered as much as they needed, and when the sun grew hot, it melted away. On the sixth day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person. All the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. He said to them in verse 23, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until morning." They saved it until morning, as Moses commanded, and it didn't stink or have maggots in it. Verse 25 records Moses saying, "Eat it today, because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any of it on the ground today. 6 days you are to gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will not be any." Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather, but they found none. The Lord said to Moses in verse 28, "How long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That is why on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the 7th day. No one is to go out." So the people rested on the 7th day. The people of Israel called the bread manna. Verse 31 describes it. "It was white like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey." Moses said in verse 32, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Take an omer of manna and keep it for the generations to come, so they can see the bread I gave you to eat in the wilderness when I brought you out of Egypt." Moses told Aaron to take a jar and put an omer of manna in it, then place it before the Lord to be kept for the generations. Aaron did as the Lord commanded Moses and put the manna with the tablets of the covenant law, so it could be preserved. Verse 35 tells us, "The Israelites ate manna 40 years, until they came to a land that was settled. They ate manna until they reached the border of Canaan." The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. Chapter 17, verse 2 says, "So they quarreled with Moses and said, 'Give us water to drink.' Moses replied, 'Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?' But the people were thirsty and grumbled against Moses, asking in verse 3, 'Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?' Moses cried out to the Lord in verse 4, 'What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me.' The Lord answered Moses with clear instructions in verse 5, 'Go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink.' Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. He called the place Massah and Meribah because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying in verse 7, 'Is the Lord among us or not?' Then the Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua in verse 9, 'Choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands.' Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. Verse 11 tells us something remarkable. As long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning, but whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. When Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held his hands up, one on one side and one on the other, so that his hands remained steady till sunset. Verse 13 says, "So Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword." Then the Lord said to Moses in verse 14, Write this on a scroll as something to be remembered and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven." Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner." He said in verse 16, "Because hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation." Jethro, the priest of Midian and Moses' father-in-law, heard of everything God had done for Moses and for his people Israel, and how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Chapter 18, verse 2 tells us, "After Moses had sent away his wife Zipporah, his father-in-law Jethro received her and her 2 sons. One son was named Gershom, because Moses had said he had become a foreigner in a foreign land. The other was named Eleazar, because he said the God of his father was his helper and saved him from the sword of Pharaoh. Jethro came to Moses in the wilderness, where he was camped near the mountain of God. Verse 6 records, "Jethro, your father-in-law, is coming to you, and your wife is with him, and her 2 sons are with her." Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. They greeted each other and then went into the tent. Moses told his father-in-law about everything the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and about all the hardships they had met along the way and how the Lord had saved them. Jethro was delighted to hear about all the good things the Lord had done for Israel in rescuing them. Verse 10 says, he said, "Praise be to the Lord, who rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians and of Pharaoh, and who rescued the people from the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods, for he did this to those who had treated Israel arrogantly." Jethro brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. The next day, Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people, and they stood around him from morning till evening. When his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing, he asked in verse 14, "What is this you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge, while all these people stand around you from morning till evening?" Moses answered in verse 15, "Because the people come to me to seek God's will. Whenever they have a dispute, it is brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and instructions." Jethro replied with wise counsel in verse 17, "What you are doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone." Jethro advised Moses in verse 19, "Listen now to me, and I will give you some advice, and may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to him. Teach them his decrees and instructions, and show them the way they are to live and how they are to behave. But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them serve as judges for the people at all times, but have them bring every difficult case to you. The simple cases they can decide themselves. That will make your load lighter, because they will share it with you. If you do this, and God so commands, you will be able to stand the strain, and all these people will go home satisfied." Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. Verse 25 tells us he chose capable men from all Israel and made them leaders of the people, officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. They served as judges for the people at all times. The difficult cases they brought to Moses, but the simple ones they decided themselves. Then Moses sent his father-in-law on his way, and Jethro returned to his own country. On the first day of the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt, they came to the desert of Sinai. Chapter 19, verse 2 says, "After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain." Chapter 19, verse 3 records God's message, This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. Verse 8 tells us, the people all responded together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." So Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. The Lord said to Moses in verse 9, "I am going to come to you in a dense cloud, so that the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you." Moses told the Lord what the people had said, and the Lord gave him instructions in verse 10. "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes and be ready by the third day, because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people." Moses was to put limits for the people around the mountain and tell them to be careful not to approach it or touch the foot of it. Verse 12 warns, "Whoever touches the mountain is to be put to death." No hand was to be laid on them. They were to be stoned or shot with arrows, whether people or animals. Only when the ram's horn sounded a long blast could they approach the mountain. Moses went down and consecrated the people, and they washed their clothes. He said to the people in verse 15, "Prepare yourselves for the third day. Abstain from sexual relations." On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Verse 16 says, "Everyone in the camp trembled." Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. Verse 18 describes it. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. The sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. The Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. Moses went up, and the Lord said to him in verse 21, "Go down and warn the people, so they do not force their way through to see the Lord, and many of them perish. Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them." Moses replied in verse 23, "The people cannot come up Mount Sinai, because you yourself warned us. Put limits around the mountain and set it apart as holy." The Lord told him to go down and bring Aaron up with him, but the priests and people must not force their way through to come up to the Lord, or he would break out against them. So Moses went down to the people and told them. God spoke all these words. Chapter 20 verse 2 begins, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." The first commandment in verse 3 states, "You shall have no other gods before me." The second commandment follows in verse 4. "You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments." The third commandment in verse 7 says, "You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name." The fourth commandment is given in verse 8. "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. The fifth commandment in verse 12 states, "Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you." The sixth commandment in verse 13 simply says, "You shall not murder." The seventh commandment follows, "You shall not commit adultery." The eighth commandment states, "You shall not steal." The ninth commandment in verse 16 says, "You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor." The 10th and final commandment in verse 17 declares, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor." When the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses in verse 19, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die." Moses said to the people in verse 20, "Do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning." The people remained at a distance, while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. The Lord said to Moses in verse 22, "Tell the Israelites this, you have seen for yourselves that I have spoken to you from heaven. Do not make any gods to be alongside me. Do not make for yourselves gods of silver or gods of gold." The Lord gave Moses specific laws to present to the people after they had agreed to the covenant at Mount Sinai. These were practical instructions for daily life that would set Israel apart from all other nations. Chapter 21 begins with instructions about Hebrew servants, showing God's concern for those who fell into servitude. Verse 2 says, "If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years. But in the 7th year he shall go free, without paying anything." This was radically different from the slavery they had experienced in Egypt. If the servant came alone, he would go free alone. If he had a wife when he came, she would go with him. But if his master gave him a wife, and she bore him sons or daughters, the woman and her children would belong to her master, and only the man would go free. However, verse 5 tells us something remarkable about choice and love. "But if the servant declares, 'I love my master and my wife and children, and do not want to go free,' then his master must take him before the judges. The master would take him to the door or doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. This pierced ear would be a permanent sign that he had chosen to stay, and he would become his servant for life. This showed that service motivated by love was honored even in the law. If a man sold his daughter as a servant, she was not to go free as male servants did. If she didn't please the master who had selected her, he must let her be redeemed. Verse 11 says, "If he does not provide her with these 3 things, she is to go free without any payment of money." These laws protected vulnerable women. The Lord gave laws about personal injuries that would protect human life and ensure justice. Verse 12 states clearly, "Anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death." But God made room for accidents. Verse 13 continues, "However, if it is not done intentionally, but God lets it happen, they are to flee to a place I will designate. This would later become the cities of refuge. But if anyone schemed and killed someone deliberately, that person was to be taken even from God's altar and put to death." Verse 15 says, "Anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. Anyone who kidnaps someone must be put to death." Verse 17 declares, "Anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death." If people quarreled and one hit another with a stone or fist, and the victim didn't die but was confined to bed, the one who struck the blow must pay for any loss of time and see that the victim was completely healed. Laws address situations where people fought and hit a pregnant woman. Verse 23 gives an important principle. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. This wasn't about encouraging revenge. It was about ensuring that punishment was proportional to the crime. Chapter 22 gave laws about property and responsibility. Verse 1 says, "Whoever steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it must pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep." The restitution was greater than what was stolen. Verse 2 addresses home invasion. If a thief is caught breaking in at night and is struck a fatal blow, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed, but if it happens after sunrise, the defender is guilty of bloodshed. A thief must make restitution. If anyone grazed their livestock in someone else's field, they must make restitution from the best of their own field. If a fire broke out and burned grain, the one who started it must make restitution. The Lord gave instructions about social responsibilities and protecting the vulnerable. Verse 21 says, with emphasis, "Do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt." They were to remember their own suffering. They must not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. If they did, and these people cried out to God, He would certainly hear. If they lent money to someone needy, they were not to charge interest. If they took their neighbor's cloak as a pledge, they were to return it by sunset. Verse 27 says, "When they cry out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate." Verse 28 says, "Do not blaspheme God or curse the ruler of your people." They must give God the firstborn of their sons and animals. Chapter 23 gave more laws about justice. Verse 1 says, "Do not spread false reports. Do not help a guilty person by being a malicious witness." They must not follow the crowd in doing wrong. If they came across their enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, they must return it. Verse 5 says, "If you see the donkey of someone who hates you fallen down under its load, do not leave it there. Be sure you help them with it." They were to show compassion even to enemies. They must not deny justice to poor people or accept bribes. They must not oppress a foreigner. The Lord established the Sabbath year. For 6 years they were to sow their fields, but during the 7th year they were to let the land rest. For 6 days they were to work, but on the 7th day they must not work, so their animals and servants could rest. God commanded them to celebrate 3 festivals each year. Verse 14 says, 3 times a year you are to celebrate a festival to me. They were to celebrate the festival of unleavened bread in the month of Aviv. They were to celebrate the festival of harvest with the first fruits. They were to celebrate the festival of ingathering at the end of the year when they gathered their crops. The Lord told Moses to come up to him on the mountain with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. Chapter 24, verse 1 says, "You are to worship at a distance, but Moses alone is to approach the Lord. The others must not come near, and the people may not come up with him." This showed the holiness of God and the special role Moses had as mediator between God and the people. Moses went down and told the people all the Lord's words and laws. They responded together with one voice, showing their unity. Verse 3 records their commitment, "Everything the Lord has said we will do." This was a momentous declaration, an entire nation agreeing to enter into covenant with God. Moses then wrote down everything the Lord had said. This wasn't just an oral agreement, it was recorded in writing. He got up early the next morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain. He set up 12 stone pillars representing the 12 tribes. This was a visual representation of the entire nation standing before God. Verse 5 says, "Then he sent young Israelite men, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as fellowship offerings to the Lord." These sacrifices were essential for making the covenant. The burnt offerings showed complete dedication to God. Moses took half of the blood and put it in bowls, and the other half he splashed against the altar. The blood on the altar represented God's part in the covenant. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. He wanted to make sure they understood what they were agreeing to. They responded again in verse 7, "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey." This showed they had heard and understood. Then Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people. Verse 8 records his words, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." The blood connected both parties. God and his people were bound together in a life and death covenant. This was serious and sacred. Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders went up the mountain. What happened next was extraordinary. Verse 10 describes their experience. They saw the God of Israel. Under his feet was something like a pavement made of lapis lazuli, as bright blue as the sky. They actually saw God. Not his face, but something of his glory and majesty. But verse 11 tells us something amazing. But God did not raise his hand against these leaders of the Israelites. They saw God, and they ate and drank. Despite seeing God's glory, they weren't destroyed. They shared a covenant meal in his presence, representing peace and fellowship between God and his people. Then the Lord said to Moses in verse 12, "Come up to me on the mountain and stay here, and I will give you the tablets of stone with the law and commandments I have written for their instruction." God was calling Moses to come even closer and receive something precious, stone tablets with God's own writing. Moses set out with Joshua, his aide. He said to the elders in verse 14, "Wait here for us until we come back to you. Aaron and Hur are with you, and anyone involved in a dispute can go to them." He was making sure the people would be cared for while he was gone. When Moses went up on the mountain, the cloud covered it. This wasn't an ordinary cloud. It was the visible presence of God's glory. The glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai, and for 6 days the cloud covered the mountain. Moses waited. For 6 full days he stood there, waiting for God to call him. This taught patience and reverence. On the 7th day, the Lord called to Moses from within the cloud. Verse 17 says, "To the Israelites the glory of the Lord looked like a consuming fire on top of the mountain." From below, God's glory appeared as fire, powerful, dangerous, holy. Then Moses entered the cloud as he went on up the mountain. He walked right into that consuming fire, into the very presence of God. Verse 18 tells us, "And he stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. 40 days without food or water, just in God's presence, receiving instructions." The Lord spoke to Moses on the mountain, beginning with instructions about how the people should bring materials. Chapter 25, verse 2 says, "Tell the Israelites to bring me an offering. You are to receive the offering for me from everyone whose heart prompts them to give." This was important. The offering had to be voluntary, from willing hearts. God didn't want forced contributions. The materials included gold, silver and bronze, blue and purple and scarlet yarn, fine linen, goat hair, ram skins, acacia wood, olive oil, spices, and precious stones. Then God revealed the purpose. Verse 8 declares, "Then have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them." This was the goal. God wanted to live among his people. He wanted a physical place where he could meet with them. Verse 9 adds, "Make this tabernacle and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you." Everything had to be done according to God's specific design. God began with the most important piece, the Ark of the Covenant. Verse 10 says, "Have them make an ark of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high." This wooden chest would be the center of Israel's worship. They were to overlay it with pure gold inside and outside. They were to cast 4 gold rings and make poles for carrying. Verse 15 gives an important command. The poles are to remain in the rings of this ark. They are not to be removed. The ark would always be ready to move. They were to place in the ark the tablets of the covenant law. Then they were to make an atonement cover of pure gold. Verse 18 instructs, and make 2 cherubim out of hammered gold at the ends of the cover. These cherubim had to be hammered from the same piece of gold as the cover. The cherubim were to have their wings spread upward, overshadowing the cover. Then God gave an amazing promise in verse 22. There, above the cover between the 2 cherubim that are over the ark of the covenant law, I will meet with you and give you all my commands for the Israelites. This space would be where God's presence would dwell. Next came instructions for the table. Verse 23 says, make a table of acacia wood, 2 cubits long, a cubit wide, and a cubit and a half high. They were to overlay it with pure gold and make rings and poles for carrying. They were to make plates and dishes of pure gold. Verse 30 commands, put the bread of the presence on this table to be before me at all times. This bread would be a continual reminder that God provided for his people. The lampstand required special skill. Verse 31 says, make a lampstand of pure gold, hammer out its base and shaft, and make its flower-like cups, buds, and blossoms of one piece with it. This entire lampstand had to be hammered from one solid piece of gold, no pieces joined together. Verse 32 describes 6 branches are to extend from the sides of the lampstand, 3 on one side and 3 on the other. So there would be 7 lamps total. 3 cups shaped like almond flowers were to be on each branch. Verse 36 emphasizes, the buds and branches shall all be of one piece with the lampstand, hammered out of pure gold. They were to make 7 lamps to light the space. Verse 40 warns, see that you make them according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. Chapter 26 gives instructions for the tabernacle structure. Verse 1 says, make the tabernacle with 10 curtains of finely twisted linen and blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, with cherubim woven into them by a skilled worker. These inner curtains would be beautiful. 5 curtains were to be joined together, and the other 5 also joined, creating 2 huge panels. They were to make loops and gold clasps to fasten them together. Over these, they were to make 11 curtains of goat hair for protection. Over that, coverings of ram skins and durable leather. The framework would be made of upright frames of acacia wood. Each frame was to be 10 cubits long and a cubit and a half wide. For the south side, they were to make 20 frames with 40 silver bases. The same for the north side. For the west end, 6 frames plus 2 corner frames. They were to overlay all frames with gold and make gold rings for crossbars. They were to set up the tabernacle according to the plan. Then came the most important curtain, the veil. Verse 33 instructs, hang the curtain from the clasps and place the ark of the covenant law behind the curtain. The curtain will separate the holy place from the most holy place. Chapter 27 begins with the altar. Verse 1 says, build an altar of acacia wood, 3 cubits high. It is to be square, 5 cubits long, and 5 cubits wide. This altar was to be overlaid with bronze. They were to make all its utensils of bronze and poles for carrying. God gave instructions for the courtyard surrounding the tabernacle. Verse 9 of chapter 27 says, make a courtyard for the tabernacle. The south side shall be 100 cubits long, and is to have curtains of finely twisted linen, with 20 posts and 20 bronze bases, and with silver hooks and bands on the posts. The north side was also to be 100 cubits long. The west end was to be 50 cubits wide. The east end was also 50 cubits wide, but this is where the entrance would be. For the entrance, verse 16 says, provide a curtain 20 cubits long of blue, purple, and scarlet yarn and finely twisted linen, the work of an embroiderer, with 4 posts and 4 bases. Then came a special command about the lamps. Verse 20 says, "Command the Israelites to bring you clear oil of crushed olives for the light, so that the lamps may be kept burning." In the tent of meeting, outside the curtain that shields the ark of the covenant law, Aaron and his sons are to keep the lamps burning before the Lord from evening till morning. This is to be a lasting ordinance among the Israelites for the generations to come. The light was never to go out completely. Chapter 28 begins with instructions for the special clothing the priests would wear. Verse 1 says, "Have Aaron your brother brought to you from among the Israelites, along with his sons Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar and Ithamar, so they may serve me as priests." This was the formal establishment of the priesthood. They were to make sacred garments for Aaron to give him dignity and honor. Verse 4 lists what they were to make. These are the garments they are to make: a breastpiece, an ephod, a robe, a woven tunic, a turban, and a sash. They are to make these sacred garments for your brother Aaron and his sons, so they may serve me as priests. The ephod was a special garment. Verse 6 says, "Make the ephod of gold, and of blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, and of finely twisted linen, the work of a skilled craftsman. It is to have 2 shoulder pieces attached to 2 of its corners, so it can be fastened. They were to take 2 onyx stones and engrave on them the names of the sons of Israel, 6 names on one stone and 6 on the other." Verse 12 explains, "Aaron is to bear the names on his shoulders as a memorial before the Lord." Whenever Aaron ministered, he would carry the names of all 12 tribes on his shoulders. The breastpiece was even more elaborate. Verse 15 says, "Fashion a breastpiece for making decisions, the work of a skilled craftsman. Make it like the ephod, of gold and of blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, and of finely twisted linen." It was to be square when folded double. Then they were to mount 4 rows of precious stones. Verse 17 describes them. "The first row shall be carnelian, chrysolite, and beryl. The second row shall be turquoise, lapis lazuli, and emerald. The third row shall be jacinth, agate, and amethyst. The fourth row shall be topaz, onyx, and jasper." There were to be 12 stones, 1 for each tribe. Verse 29 declares, "Whenever Aaron enters the holy place, he will bear the names of the sons of Israel over his heart on the breastpiece of decision as a continuing memorial before the Lord." They were to put the Urim and Thummim in the breastpiece. Verse 30 says, "Thus Aaron will always bear the means of making decisions for the Israelites over his heart before the Lord." The robe was to be entirely blue. Verse 33 instructs, "Make pomegranates of blue, purple, and scarlet yarn around the hem of the robe, with gold bells between them." Aaron must wear this when he ministered. Verse 35 explains, "The sound of the bells will be heard when he enters the holy place before the Lord, and when he comes out, so that he will not die." They were to make a plate of pure gold, engraved "Holy to the Lord," and attach it to the turban. Verse 38 explains, "It will be on Aaron's forehead, and he will bear the guilt involved in the sacred gifts the Israelites consecrate, whatever their gifts may be." Chapter 29 provides detailed instructions for consecrating the priests. Verse 1 says, "This is what you are to do to consecrate them, so they may serve me as priests. Take a young bull and 2 rams without defect." Moses was to bring Aaron and his sons and wash them with water. Then he was to dress Aaron in the sacred garments and anoint him by pouring oil on his head. He was to bring Aaron's sons and dress them. The priesthood would be theirs by a lasting ordinance. The sacrifices had to follow a specific order. First came the sin offering. Moses was to bring the bull, and Aaron and his sons were to lay their hands on its head. Then Moses was to slaughter it and apply blood to the altar. Next came the first ram for the burnt offering. Verse 18 says, "Then burn the entire ram on the altar. It is a burnt offering to the Lord, a pleasing aroma." Then came the ram for ordination. Moses was to take some blood and put it on the right ears, thumbs, and big toes of Aaron and his sons. This ordination would last 7 days. Every day they were to sacrifice a bull and make atonement. Every day they were to offer 2 lambs, one in the morning and one at twilight. Verse 42 says, "For the generations to come, this burnt offering is to be made regularly at the entrance to the tent of meeting before the Lord. There I will meet you and speak to you." God promised in verse 45, "Then I will dwell among the Israelites and be their God. They will know that I am the Lord their God, who brought them out of Egypt, so that I might dwell among them." The Lord gave instructions for one more piece of furniture, the altar of incense. Chapter 30, verse 1 says, "Make an altar of acacia wood for burning incense. It is to be square, a cubit long and a cubit wide, and 2 cubits high, its horns of 1 piece with it." This altar would be smaller than the bronze altar, but still significant. It was to be overlaid with pure gold. Verse 6 gives the placement, "Put the altar in front of the curtain that shields the ark of the covenant law, before the atonement cover that is over the tablets of the covenant law, where I will meet with you." This altar would be right next to the veil, as close as possible to God's presence. Aaron must burn fragrant incense on this altar every morning when he tended the lamps. He must burn incense again when he lit the lamps at twilight, so incense would burn regularly before the Lord for all generations. They were not to offer on this altar any other incense or any burnt offering. Verse 10 says, "Once a year Aaron shall make atonement on its horns. This annual atonement must be made with the blood of the atoning sin offering for the generations to come. It is most holy to the Lord." The Lord spoke about taking a census. Verse 12 says, "When you take a census of the Israelites to count them, each one must pay the Lord a ransom for his life at the time he is counted. Then no plague will come on them when you number them." Each one was to give a half shekel. This half shekel was an offering to the Lord. Verse 15 makes an important declaration. "The rich are not to give more than a half shekel, and the poor are not to give less when you make the offering to the Lord to atone for your lives." This showed that everyone was equal before God. Rich and poor gave exactly the same amount. They were to receive this atonement money and use it for the service of the tent of meeting. The Lord instructed Moses to make a bronze basin. Verse 18 says, "Make a bronze basin with its bronze stand for washing. Place it between the tent of meeting and the altar and put water in it." Aaron and his sons were to wash their hands and feet with water from it. Whenever they entered the tent of meeting, they were to wash so they wouldn't die. When they approached the altar to minister, they were to wash so they wouldn't die. Verse 21 emphasizes, "This is to be a lasting ordinance for Aaron and his descendants for the generations to come." Cleanliness was essential when approaching God. The Lord told Moses to take the finest spices for sacred anointing oil. Verse 23 lists them. "Take the following fine spices, 500 shekels of liquid myrrh, half as much, that is 250 shekels, of fragrant cinnamon, 250 shekels of fragrant calamus, 500 shekels of cassia, all according to the sanctuary shekel, and a hin of olive oil." He was to make these into a sacred anointing oil, a fragrant blend. Verse 26 instructs, "Then use it to anoint the tent of meeting, the ark of the covenant law, the table and all its articles, the lampstand and its accessories, the altar of incense, the altar of burnt offering and all its utensils, and the basin with its stand." Everything was to be anointed. He was to anoint Aaron and his sons and consecrate them. Verse 31 gives a stern warning. "Say to the Israelites, this is to be my sacred anointing oil for the generations to come. Do not pour it on anyone else's body, and do not make any other oil using the same formula. It is sacred, and you are to consider it sacred. Whoever makes perfume like it and puts it on anyone other than a priest must be cut off from their people." This oil was exclusively for holy purposes. The Lord also gave instructions for sacred incense. He was to take fragrant spices, gum resin, onycha and galbanum, and pure frankincense in equal amounts, and make a fragrant blend. It was to be salted and pure and sacred. He was to grind some to powder and place it in front of the ark. Verse 36 declares, "It shall be most holy to you." They were not to make any incense with this formula for themselves. Verse 38 warns, "Whoever makes incense like it to enjoy its fragrance must be cut off from their people." The Lord spoke to Moses about the skilled workers he had chosen. Chapter 31 verse 2 says, "See, I have chosen Bezalel, son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge, and with all kinds of skills, to make artistic designs for work in gold, silver, and bronze, to cut and set stones, to work in wood, and to engage in all kinds of crafts." This was a remarkable gift. God himself filled Bezalel with his spirit. God also appointed Oholiab, son of Ahisamach, to help him, and gave ability to all the skilled workers to make everything he commanded. The Lord emphasized the Sabbath. Verse 13 says, "Say to the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbaths. This will be a sign between me and you for the generations to come, so you may know that I am the Lord, who makes you holy." Anyone who desecrated the Sabbath was to be put to death. Verse 17 declares, "It will be a sign between me and the Israelites forever." When the Lord finished speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him the 2 tablets of the covenant law, the tablets of stone inscribed by the finger of God. These weren't written by human hands. God himself wrote on these stones. But while this was happening on the mountain, something terrible occurred below. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down, they gathered around Aaron. Chapter 32, verse 1 records their demand. "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." After everything they had seen, they were already turning away from God. Aaron's response was tragic. Verse 2 says, "Aaron answered them, 'Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me.'" Instead of standing firm, Aaron participated. All the people brought their earrings. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They said in verse 4, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." How quickly they forgot. When Aaron saw their response, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced in verse 5, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." They rose early, sacrificed offerings, and indulged in revelry. Meanwhile, the Lord said to Moses in verse 7, "Go down, because your people whom you brought up out of Egypt have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf." Notice that God called them your people, Moses' people, not his own. God was distancing himself from them. He told Moses he had seen these people and they were stiff-necked. Verse 10 says, "Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation." This was a test for Moses. God was offering to start over with him. But Moses showed his character by pleading for the people. Verse 11 records his prayer, "Lord, why should your anger burn against your people, whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, 'It was with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth'? Turn from your fierce anger. Relent and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give your descendants all this land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever." Moses was holding God to his own promises, and verse 14 tells us the amazing result. Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened. Moses' intercession had saved the entire nation. Moses came down with the tablets. When he saw the calf and the dancing, his anger burned, and he threw the tablets, breaking them to pieces. This was a powerful symbolic act. The people had already broken God's covenant, so Moses broke the physical tablets. He took the calf, burned it, ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the Israelites drink it. They would literally consume their sin. Moses confronted Aaron in verse 21. "What did these people do to you, that you led them into such great sin?" Aaron made excuses, claiming in verse 24, "I threw it into the fire and out came this calf," as if the calf had just appeared by itself. Aaron refused to take responsibility. Moses stood at the entrance to the camp and called in, verse 26, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." All the Levites rallied to him. Moses commanded them to take their swords and go through the camp. The Levites obeyed, and about 3,000 people died that day. Verse 29 says, "Then Moses said, 'You have been set apart to the Lord today, for you were against your own sons and brothers, and he has blessed you this day.'" The next day, Moses said in verse 30, "You have committed a great sin. But now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin." Moses went back and prayed in verses 31 and 32. "Oh, what a great sin these people have committed. They have made themselves gods of gold. But now please forgive their sin. But if not, then blot me out of the book you have written." Moses was willing to give up his own salvation if it meant the people could be forgiven. This was astounding love. The Lord replied in verse 33, "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book." God wouldn't punish Moses for the people's sin. Each person was responsible for their own actions. God told Moses to lead the people to the promised land, but his angel would go before them. Verse 35 says, "And the Lord struck the people with a plague because of what they did with the calf Aaron had made." Chapter 33 begins with devastating words in verse 3. "But I will not go with you, because you are a stiff-necked people, and I might destroy you on the way." When the people heard this, they began to mourn. Getting the promised land without God's presence was no blessing. Moses used to take a tent and pitch it outside the camp, calling it the tent of meeting. Verse 9 says, "As Moses went into the tent, the pillar of cloud would come down and stay at the entrance, while the Lord spoke with Moses." The Lord would speak to Moses face to face, as one speaks to a friend. Moses pleaded with God in verse 13, "If you are pleased with me, teach me your ways, so I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people." The Lord replied in verse 14, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." God relented. Moses then made a bold request, "Now show me your glory." The Lord said he would cause all his goodness to pass in front of Moses. But verse 20 says, "But you cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." So God said in verse 22, "When my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by." The Lord told Moses in chapter 34, verse 1, "Chisel out 2 stone tablets like the first ones, and I will write on them the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke." Moses did as commanded and went up Mount Sinai. The Lord came down in the cloud and proclaimed his name. Verse 6 says, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished." Moses immediately bowed and worshipped. He prayed in verse 9, "Lord, if I have found favor in your eyes, then let the Lord go with us. Although this is a stiff-necked people, forgive our wickedness and our sin, and take us as your inheritance." The Lord agreed to renew the covenant. He would do wonders never before done. Verse 28 says, Moses was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights without eating bread or drinking water. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. When Moses came down with the 2 new tablets, his face was radiant because he had been in God's presence, though he wasn't aware of it himself. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses' face glowing, they were afraid to come near him. But Moses called to them, and they came back. He spoke to them and gave them all the commands. Verse 33 says, When Moses finished speaking to them, he put a veil over his face. Whenever he entered the Lord's presence, he would remove the veil, but when he came out, he would put it back on. Chapter 35 begins with Moses assembling the whole community. He reminded them about the Sabbath and announced it was time to bring offerings for the tabernacle. Everyone whose heart was willing was to bring materials. Then something beautiful happened. The whole community withdrew, and everyone whose heart moved them came and brought offerings. Verse 21 says, Everyone who was willing and whose heart moved them came and brought an offering to the Lord. Men and women alike brought gold jewelry. Everyone brought what they had. The skilled women spun yarn. Leaders brought gems. They brought offerings morning after morning, with such generosity that the skilled workers finally had to tell Moses in chapter 36, verse 5, The people are bringing more than enough for doing the work the Lord commanded to be done. Moses actually had to give an order to stop bringing offerings. Verse 7 says, Because what they already had was more than enough to do all the work. Bezalel, Oholiab, and all the skilled workers began making everything according to God's pattern. They made the curtains with cherubim woven into them, the frames overlaid with gold, the veil separating the holy place from the most holy place. Bezalel made the ark, overlaying it with pure gold. He made the mercy seat with its 2 cherubim. He made the table and the lampstand of pure gold. He made the altar of incense. In chapter 37 and 38, each piece was crafted exactly as God commanded. Bezalel made the bronze altar for burnt offerings. He made the bronze basin from the mirrors of the women who served at the entrance. They made the courtyard with its curtains, posts, and bases. From the blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, they made the woven garments for ministering in the sanctuary. Chapter 39 describes the making of all the priestly garments. The ephod with its skillfully woven waistband, the 2 onyx stones with Israel's names, the breastpiece with 12 precious stones, the robe with its blue fabric and pomegranates and golden bells. They made the tunics, the turban, the caps, the undergarments. Verse 30 says, They made the plate, the sacred emblem, out of pure gold and engraved on it, like an inscription on a seal, Holy to the Lord. Everything was completed exactly as the Lord had commanded. The Israelites brought all their work to Moses, the tabernacle with all its furnishings, the ark, the table, the lampstand, the altars, the basin, the curtains, all the garments. Verse 43 says, Moses inspected the work and saw that they had done it just as the Lord had commanded. So Moses blessed them. The Lord told Moses in chapter 40, verse 2, Set up the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, on the first day of the first month. Moses did everything exactly as the Lord commanded. Verse 17 says, So the tabernacle was set up on the first day of the first month in the 2nd year. Moses erected the tabernacle piece by piece. He placed the tablets in the ark, attached the poles, and put the mercy seat on top. He brought the ark into the tabernacle and hung the shielding curtain. He placed the table, the lampstand, the golden altar in their positions. He set the bronze altar near the entrance and offered sacrifices. He placed the basin for washing. He set up the courtyard. Verse 33 says, And so Moses finished the work. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Verse 35 says, Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. God's presence was so powerful that even Moses couldn't enter. Verse 36 describes what would happen from that point forward. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. God's visible presence would guide them. When the cloud moved, they moved. When it stayed, they stayed. The cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all Israel during their travels. They were no longer slaves without hope. They were God's people, and He lived among them. The journey through the wilderness would continue, but now they had something precious, the presence of God dwelling in their midst, leading them every step of the way toward the promised land. The glory of God had finally come down to dwell among His people. The tabernacle stood complete, filled with His presence, a cloud by day and fire by night guiding Israel forward. From slavery in Egypt to a covenant nation with God living in their midst, this was the ultimate fulfillment of His promise. If this journey through Exodus has impacted you, subscribe to continue exploring the powerful stories of Scripture. Share this video with someone who needs to discover how God makes a way when there seems to be no way. The story of God's redemption is far from over. It's only just begun. Stay with us as we continue through the incredible narrative of God's Word.